next speaker will be Professor Bruce Janz. He will be speaking to us on moral enhancement, African philosophy, humanism, and the question of morality. Professor Janz is a professor in the Department of Philosophy, co-director of the Center for Humanities and Digital Research, and co-faculty in the Text and Technology PhD program, all at University of Central Florida. He works in African philosophy, concept of place and space across many disciplines, digital humanities, and contemporary European philosophy. Prof, please, you can talk to us. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I hope you can all hear me okay. I am not going to use a PowerPoint. I'm just going to talk and hopefully keep your interest throughout this next few minutes. I'd like to thank the speakers that have gone before me. I want to do something, I guess, a little bit more narrowly focused. What I want to think about is the question of moral enhancement itself and some of the reasoning around that or behind that. This paper will examine one aspect of the claim that morality can be achieved through technological means. And so what I want to do is look at, go back to the well of Ubuntu that has nourished so many, but particularly one version of Ubuntu, which is that of Mogobe Ramosa, who I think presents to us a very interesting version of Ubuntu. And I want to think through what moral enhancement might look like. I want to take the question of enhancement in general out of a kind of what I think of as a teleological sort of framework. We often think of enhancement as something which is going to enable a particular kind of outcome. In other words, move us towards something that we desire. And that's certainly true about moral enhancement itself. If you think about it, of course, that's a difficult proposition with any kind of enhancement, really. And the reason is that we are complex beings, and by complex, I don't just mean complicated. I mean we are beings who are part of what we might think of as complexity theory. We exist in a world in which our actions have unintended consequences. We find ourselves doing things in response to prompts that we did not anticipate. We find that we can try to move towards a particular kind of outcome, and the world changes around us. You know, our best efforts don't always lead to where we think they should lead to. And so I want to take enhancement out of a kind of teleological framework and put it in this kind of complexity theory framework, which I think is much more interesting. I also want to look at a very specific kind of reason for wanting moral enhancement itself. I think it's all well and good to talk about moral enhancement as a kind of generalized response to a feeling that morals have declined in society in general. But if you look in history, if you look in the texts of history in most cultures, what you will find is reports of that going back hundreds of years. People have always thought that today is a moral decline from the past. You can find those texts in ancient Rome. You can find them in many historical traditions. And so I have to ask, why now? Why are we talking about moral enhancement now? And I think there's one possible answer to that, apart from that kind of generalized feeling that morals are declining. And it's given to us by Ingmar Persson and Julian Savulescu in their kind of very important book that kind of launched the discussion of moral enhancement. It's called Unfit for the Future, The Need for Moral Enhancement, and this was in 2014. They had done some papers previous to that on this topic, but that's the book that's well known. And what they identify is not just a kind of generalized sense that morality has declined in society, but rather a very specific kind of tension that they believe necessitates moral enhancement now. And that is a tension between the kind of mismatch between what we might think of as moral, social, political development on the one hand, and technological development on the other hand. In other words, technology develops much faster than our ability to think about it with using our moral apparatus, our social customs, our political ideas. And so they see very specific kind of threats that have come out of that. One of them is the climate crisis, and the other one is the threat of nuclear annihilation. And so they see those two as being very kind of urgent reasons why we need to do something different, essentially. We cannot simply rely on what we have relied on before in order to come to terms with the changes in society. So, I mean, I like to get specific about these things. So that's a very specific kind of tension. And I think it's important to focus on that, because I think to the extent that we focus on, let's say, the generalized sense that morality in society has declined, the answers to that are going to be often problematic kinds of answers. They're going to be answers in which we propose that people, in effect, become more like us, right? We are, after all, the moral ones. That's almost always the way people think about themselves. And if only those other people out there would agree with us in some way, then society would be peaceful, society would be good. And of course, you can very quickly see the problems with that. We're all very different people. Unanimity of thought is certainly not a desirable outcome. We have in the 19th century in Europe attempts to solve this same problem. I mean, they recognized this problem of the mismatch between society and technology back then. So we have what are called utopian projects, essentially. And these utopian projects are, in effect, ways of reorganizing society in order to deal with the modern world. In some cases, they denied the modern world. And in some cases, they embraced the modern world and tried to organize society in such a way that people could absorb that technology and use it for good rather than simply for evil. And what it usually required was a rethinking not just of the individual, but of the entire social apparatus, the entire social organization of the world. And that's a first interesting clue, it seems to me. Their impulse was to say the answer here is to be found in the social connections that we have, not simply in augmenting individual capacities of some sort. It's worth asking, or it's worth thinking about, if we were to imagine that moral enhancement is the augmentation of individual capacities, what exactly those capacities might be. Are we, for example, thinking that we would augment the capacity for empathy? I mean, that might be a good one. If we were all a little more empathetic, we might think we would then be more moral. Of course, there are researchers that have pointed out that empathy is a kind of two-edged sword. Empathy often ends up being empathy for those who are like you. You often end up having empathy for your group, and much less so for people who are unlike you, people who are far away, people who are very different in some manner. And so empathy might simply reinforce a kind of division rather than reinforce a kind of social cohesion. So let's suppose we want to augment memory. Wouldn't it be great if we could remember the evils of the past so that we don't repeat them? Sounds pretty good. But we could also remember grudges. We could also remember just how much evil somebody has done to us in the past, and that might have exactly the opposite effect. We might enhance our rationality, right? Well, okay, what are the effects of that? Maybe we'd be able to see long-term outcomes and go for the long-term outcomes rather than short-term outcomes. That would be good, right? Yet, rationality has not always been correlated with higher morality. We can see lots of examples where people have been very rational in their need to enhance their own interests above others, let's say, or in their need to kind of engineer the world the way they like it or something like that. So my point is this. As we actually think about what enhancement exactly would entail in order to lead us to something like moral enhancement, I think we keep coming up with an ambiguous picture. Anything that you want to enhance does not get you to that goal necessarily. What it gets you to is simply a different space where then you have to deal with a new set of uncertainties. And we should expect this. I mean, if we are complex beings, if complexity theory is true, if systems theory is true, if 4E cognition is true, what that means is that we are always faced with uncertainty, and that uncertainty is right in our faces. It's not in the distant future. And so what we're doing in enhancement is really adding a perturbation to a complex system, right? It's like the butterfly effect, right? We're adding something to a complex system which has a set of effects which we cannot necessarily control, we cannot necessarily predict, but now we have to deal with it in a new way. And maybe that's okay, right? Maybe that is perfectly fine, but we have to not imagine that we are enhancing for a particular kind of outcome, because in a complex space, we cannot guarantee that we're going to get to that outcome. Now, I want to talk a little bit about Magobe Romosa, because there are a lot of versions of Ubuntu out there. And a lot of them are focused on ethics. A lot of them are focused on politics, on social order, things of that nature. That's all great. Romosa, I think, is doing something interestingly different when he talks about Ubuntu, and particularly in his 1999 book, African Philosophy Through Ubuntu. If you read Romosa, he doesn't actually talk about ethics all that much. He doesn't have a chapter on ethics in that book. He talks about ethics elsewhere. But often when he talks about ethics, he goes back to the kind of fundamentals of his version of Ubuntu, which is never about just social cohesion. It's about how we think in social cohesion. In other words, how is it possible to think given that the world looks like this, like he's describing, which is a complex world, which is a world in which we have resources to draw on in the past. Those resources might be expressed as the wisdom of ancestors. It might be expressed as proverbs, traditions. It might be expressed as elders. It might be expressed as any number of different things, but we live in a complex world. And what we are asked to do now is become human, right? So Romosa makes a lot out of his notion of being, and he always puts a hyphen in there, being. And what he wants to do is put together the being with the becoming. These two things always have to exist at the same time. And for him, that's the essence of Ubuntu. It's not just, here we have a community, now what do we do with that community? What he thinks is, we are always in the process of making that community. And that's always a task that we have before us. What he says is, the formation of Ubuntu gives ethics a particular form. One of the first principles, and this is a quote from him, is of Ubuntu ethics is the freedom from dogmatism. And so that's very important, I think, for Romosa. What he means is that morality is not just the calculation of an individual made difficult by our various limitations and corrected by in some sort of enhancement, nor is it simply the traditions of the collective honed over time to preserve the group, but potentially subordinating individual initiative. Morality lies between these two things, and it lies with what he calls the Rio mode, which is a concept that he borrows from the physicist David Bohm. And so the Rio mode I read in his work as the ability to ask a new question, right? And that's a harder thing than it looks, right? We often simply rely on the questions that we have become used to. Because we tend to think that the world is pretty much as we have always thought it was. But for Romosa, the Rio mode is the ability to ask a new question that creates us in a new way. So if we want to think about moral enhancement, I think someone like Romosa is going to be less interested in some pharmacological intervention or technological intervention that changes the individual, because as I've already argued, there are no guarantees with that, right? I mean, any change that you can imagine could lead us in any number of different directions. What he's more interested in is how it is that we can come together and deal with the uncertain world that we face. Now, that's a hard thing to do. It definitely will involve our engagement with technology, right? And so to that extent, I think enhancement is absolutely a live question. But it's not enhancement of the individual to kind of operationalize some kind of outcome. It is rather a recognition that as we have more, let's say, computing power, as we have the access to versions of artificial intelligence, as we have access to all of these sorts of things, there are new questions that open up for us that maybe were not there before, right? Because we get caught in our ways, we get set in our ways. And so as these interventions enter the world, they're like those perturbations in a complex system that I told you about. Now we have to rethink things. Now we have to think, what does it mean for us to live in this world? Not a world from before, but this world. What does it mean to create in this world? Not one that was 10 years or 20 years or 100 years ago. And so now we have a different discussion about enhancement, right? Enhancement is no longer teleological. It's no longer a notion that we are doing something, we're intervening in order to produce a particular kind of outcome, right? That's a kind of a logic of control, which I think ultimately defeats itself. What we now have to think about is, what does it mean to live in this world now? And so I think for Ewuoso, he's going to avoid a couple of kinds of answers to that question. He's going to avoid the answer which kind of takes comfort in reinscribing a set of moral beliefs of at least a small group. I think of things like the Catholic movement known as integralism. So integralism is this notion that liberal democracy has failed, and it has no real moral code, or it's demonstrated that its moral code is inadequate. And so what we ought to do is all go back to a kind of a unified moral code, and integralism says that should be traditional Catholicism, and we should enforce that politically. So many of you will recognize this, the logic of this leads us to something very dominating, even fascist. Another solution that he is not going to take, so I'm giving you solutions that Ewuoso I think is not going to take, is to find technological solutions that we cannot yet imagine within our technology itself. So what if we had an AI that we could say, okay, climate crisis, let's put all the parameters of that into our AI and ask the AI to solve it for us, right? Wouldn't that be great? But that would still require us to find a social means of actually enacting those things, right? Those who most desperately have to act are probably those who are least likely to act, i.e. the people who are the wealthiest, the people who have the most to gain from the status quo, right? The status quo is very lucrative for some people, but the status quo has to change. So they're not going to be willing to do that. So no matter how much you put into an AI and no matter how clever a solution you get, you still have the problem of actually acting in this world. So I think, the solutions that Ewuoso looks towards are the hard solutions of being human. And they're solutions that take into account the facts of our technological reality. We live in this world, not another world. We live in a world where we can deal with disease through genetic sequencing projects. We can deal with all sorts of things like that. Those, I think, have a whole other set of separate moral questions that are well worth asking. But the question I'm asking right now is there anything that we can do pharmacologically, technologically, genetically, that will bring us towards the solution of Persson and Savulescu's problem, which is this disconnect between moral and technological development? And my answer to that is, I don't think there is. But my answer also is, I think Romosa gives us some tools for thinking about what it means to live into the future through a version of Ubuntu that is not just a kind of vague notion of communalism, but rather is about a kind of a dialogue that allows us to build, cognizant of the place in which we find ourselves and cognizant of the challenges that face us in the future. And so I'm going to stop there, and I think the argument hopefully is fairly clear, and I'm going to hand it back to the moderator here.
Thank you very much, Prof, for your thought-provoking lecture. Thank you. Okay, before we open the floor for questions and contributions, I would like to acknowledge my postdoc host, Professor Olivia Abraham, who is the director at the Center for Phenomenology in South Africa. Thank you, Prof, for being here. Okay,